Do you enjoy drama? Because this is the controversial F1 Grand Prix Iceberg, and within its frosty exterior is a list of the most major controversial races in the history of Formula One. And I have spent the last 2 weeks researching all 42 races for this video. At the very top, we have stuff like Michael Masi and Crashgate, but as we descend, I promise that the entries get increasingly more obscure and dark. If you are already a Formula One fan, I would still wager that there is some stuff in this iceberg that will surprise you, unless you are this man here. And if you're brand new to F1, hopefully this video can serve sort of like a crash course on the history of the sport. And yes, we are talking about controversies, but as it turns out, most major key historical moments in this sport, really controversial. Now, to make sure that I'm able to get through all of this content, I'm not going to be giving full detailed accounts of the races. I'm just mainly focusing on the key points, so don't be scared when I skip ahead to like lap 50 in a race. It's just for time's sake and to keep the video focused. 2 more quick things before we get into it. Firstly, this is not a dedicated Formula One YouTube channel. I just talk about stuff on here that I personally find very interesting, and being a huge F1 fan myself, I thought that this would be a great iceberg to start with. Second thing is that I wanted to use race footage, but in the process of making this, I discovered that the rights holders for Formula One are very, very, very strict on what you can and cannot show. So I'm going to be using still images. I'm kind of still in a gray area there. Wish me luck. With all of that said and done, let's get into tier 1 of the iceberg, the most famous Formula One controversies of all time. The 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Now, if there is one race that everybody knows about, it's this one. The race highlights on YouTube have like 22 million views, which makes it by far and away the most watched highlights of any race on the F1 YouTube channel. For some context, the 2021 season is considered to be one of the craziest seasons of the 21st century. And this is due to the epic title fight between 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, who at the time was still hunting for his first championship. Hamilton and Verstappen were both tied at 369.5 points going into the race, and Verstappen qualified on pole position. At the start of the race, Hamilton got a better jump off the line and would take the lead before turn 1. By lap 53 in the race, Hamilton had built a 12-second gap between himself and Verstappen, who was back in second place. And it just sort of seemed inevitable that Lewis would win the championship. Then at turn 14, Williams driver Nicholas Latifi crashed into a barrier, and this would bring out the safety car. Hamilton stayed out on his used hard tyres, and Verstappen behind him pitted for a set of fresh soft tyres. The reason that Lewis stayed out on his old used hard tyres was in order to maintain track position. Because at the end of a Grand Prix, when there isn't enough time to clean up a crash, the race could very well end under safety car, which had already been seen earlier that year in the 2021 Italian Grand Prix. Racing director Michael Masi then made the unprecedented decision to let only the cars that were between Lewis and Max unlap themselves, and this would result in enough time for there to still be 1 lap of racing left at the end. Normally, what should have happened is that all of the cars unlap themselves, not just this select group, but if that had happened, there wouldn't have been time left for 1 more lap of entertaining racing at the end of the Grand Prix. So for the sake of entertainment, Masi bent the rules. This left Max in an advantageous position as he was on much more capable tyres than Lewis. And then on the epic final lap on turn 5, Max overtook Lewis and would ultimately win the Drivers' Championship. The decision by Michael Masi was immediately scrutinized, as it seemed to be manufactured entirely for entertainment purposes and did not follow correct procedure. Ultimately, the results were still upheld, but Michael Masi was fired as the racing director of Formula One. And now we have a new one. The 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, or as it is more commonly referred to as Crashgate. Now, this was actually the first F1 race to be hosted at nighttime, and it was the 15th race of the 2008 season. During qualifying, Fernando Alonso's car broke down, and he ended up having to start from 15th place on the grid. This was especially disappointing for the Renault team since they had been showing some really decent pace in practice, which they had been lacking all season up until that point. Felipe Massa qualified on pole position, Lewis Hamilton in second, and Kimi Raikkonen in third. For the race, Renault fueled Alonso super light, which would have been seen as a ridiculous strategy because Alonso was starting at the rear of the grid. However, we have to take into account the safety car rules of the 2008 season. In 2008, when the safety car comes out, the pit lane would close for 1 or 2 laps. So what this would mean is that before drivers could pit for fresh fuel and tires, the whole field would just sort of bunch up together. Alonso, being super light, pitted very early on in the race. The next lap, Renault told Alonso's teammate, Nelson Piquet Jr., who at this point was under a lot of pressure of potentially losing his seat, they ordered him to deliberately crash. So the safety car came out, bunched up the field, and then when the pit lane opened, everybody pitted except for Alonso, who was just like zip, and he just jumped the whole field. In the chaos, Ferrari epically messed up Felipe Massa's pit stop, and this would send him to the very back of the race, ruining it entirely. It wasn't the first time actually. In 2008, Ferrari had multiple pit stop problems relating to a faulty pit light that was not working properly. Most teams at the time used lollipops, but I guess Ferrari wanted to use a fancy light system, but that wasn't working. So it wasn't until a year later, in 2009, when the news broke that Nelson Piquet Jr.'s crash was staged. But when the news did break, it was one of the largest controversies in the history of racing. Renault would be disqualified from Formula One because of this, and the team principal and chief engineer were banned from all FIA sanctioned events. Now, it wasn't Renault's fault that Ferrari messed up their pit stop, but what Felipe Massa has been arguing for years is that because the race was clearly fixed, all of the results should be annulled. Now, this would make Massa the champion for 2008 since he didn't finish the race and Lewis finished in third. And at the end of the 2008 season, they were only separated by 1 point. However, it is ridiculous to penalize all teams for the actions of a single team, and so the championship results are still as they stand. The 2005 United States Grand Prix. This race was held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and was the 9th race of the season. It's one of the most infamous races in motorsport history due to the fact that out of the 20 cars that entered the race, only the 6 cars from the teams that were using Bridgestone tires, so that's Ferrari, Jordan, and Minardi, actually competed in the race. The remaining 14 cars that were all using Michelin tires would retire to the pit lane before the race even started. And this produced some of the most bizarre images in F1. Now, the reason for this whole pickle was due to safety concerns regarding the Michelin tires following major accidents from Ralf Schumacher and then the stand-in driver for his team, Ricard Zonta, at turn 13. Turns out, Michelin just rocked up with tires that were not good enough to handle the high-speed corners of the speedway, and Bridgestone had. The FIA refused to compromise on a proposal from Michelin to install a chicane at turn 13. They stated that such a rule change would be unfair to the teams on Bridgestone tires and that a last-minute change to the track layout could prove to be dangerous. And so, the race was run with only 6 cars competing. The 1989 Japanese Grand Prix. This was the 15th and penultimate race of the season and would go down as one of the most controversial races in Formula One history, as it was the culmination of an intense 2-year rivalry between McLaren teammates and multiple-time world champions Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. Going into the Grand Prix, Prost led the championship with Senna in second place. For Senna to mathematically be able to win the Drivers' Championship, he would be required to win both of the last 2 races. So the pressure was on. Both McLarens dominated qualifying, with Senna leagues ahead of the field with a time 1.7 seconds faster than anyone, including his teammate. However, Prost was actually pulling off a big brain strat. What Prost realized was that the McLaren was so dominant that they could set the car up optimized for the race and he would still be able to qualify on the front row alongside Senna, but with a car that was much better equipped for race distance than his teammate. Prost had a far superior start to Senna, and instantly took the lead. Over the first half of the race, he steadily built his lead to 6 seconds, and then after Senna had a slow pit stop, that lead would become 8 seconds. However, with a new set of tyres and the balance of power shifted, Senna began to close in. And by lap 40, Senna was able to catch Prost, and for the next 5 laps, the gap between them remained at about 1 second. On lap 47, at the 130R chicane, as Prost began to brake, Senna dived alongside him and they both came together and went into the gravel. Now, while Prost unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of his car, thinking that the championship was now settled in his favour, Senna, on the other hand, gestured to the marshals to come and push him down the escape road. His car now running, Senna pitted for repair and would rejoin the race only 5 seconds behind the new race leader, Alessandro Nannini. After a little bit more action, Senna would take the lead and he finished the race in first place. But immediately after the race, Senna was disqualified for missing the chicane following his collision with Prost. Senna alleged that the decision had actually been made by FISA president Jean-Marie Balestra to give the championship to his fellow countryman Prost. As he gained no competitive advantage, both McLaren and Senna attempted to appeal the disqualification ruling. At the FISA hearing in Paris later that week, not only was Senna's disqualification upheld, but he would also receive a $100,000 fine. And ever since, there has been debate as to who was actually at fault in the racing incident and whether or not the whole situation was even handled fairly. The 1990 Japanese Grand Prix. And just 1 year later, Japan was once again ready to serve up even more drama. The same as the previous year, the Japanese Grand Prix was the 15th and penultimate round of the season. Going into the race, Senna was leading the championship at 78 points, and in second place was his teammate Alain Prost on 69 points. Prost qualified in second and Senna grabbed pole position. However, Senna was not happy with the dirty side of the track which pole position was situated on, and he argued that pole position should always be on the racing line, which in this case it was not. The stewards initially agreed with Senna and it looked good. Senna was going to get the racing line side of the track that he wanted. But later that night, FISA president Jean-Marie Balestra would reject the proposal. And so pole position went back to being on the dirty side of the track. You remember that guy from before, yeah? At the start of the race, Prost got the better start as Senna had predicted. And as Prost was taking the lead, Senna went for the inside line on the first corner and they went and they crashed. As a result of this crash, Senna would win his second Drivers' Championship, as his lead was now insurmountable with only one race left in the season. There was intense controversy surrounding this, because it seemed like to a lot of people that Senna deliberately took Prost out of the race. And some people have speculated as to whether or not this was revenge for what happened the previous year. But either way, this is how Senna won his second Drivers' Championship. Now, there is a really interesting interview clip of Senna after the race, and I can't show it here, but it does kind of seem like Senna, he knew what he was doing. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. This one's a tough one. This was the third race of the 1994 season, and it is undoubtedly one of the darkest moments in the history of Formula One. During the first qualifying session, Rubens Barrichello would hit a curb at 225 kilometers an hour, which sent his car airborne, and then he would crash into a barrier at an impact measured at 95 Gs, after which his car would roll several times. He was knocked unconscious, but amazingly, the emergency work done by the FIA doctor Sid Watkins would save his life, and in the end, he only suffered a sprained wrist and a broken nose. Barrichello returned the next day for the race meeting, but his injuries meant that he had to sit out for the rest of the weekend. During the final qualifying sessions, Austrian rookie Ronald Ratzenberger experienced a front wing failure, and he crashed head-on into a barrier at the Villeneuve corner at a speed of 312 kilometers an hour, or 195 miles per hour. Now, there were no tire barriers or any impact absorbing installations in place at all. The resulting G-force of this crash measured to be 500 Gs, which is the highest ever recorded in Formula One. And unfortunately, Ratzenberger died on impact. And following a decade of big changes in safety during the 1980s, Ratzenberger's death would mark the very first fatality in a Formula One weekend in over 12 years. This would prompt the reformation of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, who pushed for improvements in car and circuit safety. For the Grand Prix, Ayrton Senna was on pole position, with Michael Schumacher in second and Gerhard Berger in third. At the start of the race, JJ Lehto stalled his Benetton on the grid, resulting in Pedro Lamy slamming into the back of his car, resulting in tyres and bodywork flying into the air. Several parts of the car went over the safety barrier, which is designed to protect spectators, and would result in the injuries of 9 people. The safety car was deployed and the race would end up being restarted at the end of lap 5. On the 7th lap, Ayrton Senna, who many consider to be one of the GOATs of Formula 1, and at the time he was the most popular racing driver on the planet, was leading the race to Michael Schumacher, who was in second. As Senna approached the turn at the Tamburello left corner at a speed of 305 kilometers an hour, or 190 miles an hour, he lost control of his car and went straight into an unprotected concrete barrier. A piece of suspension breached Senna's helmet, and the 3-time world champion was killed instantly. When track officials examined Senna's car, they found in it a furled Austrian flag. Senna had intended to raise this after the race in honor of Ratzenberger, who died the day previously. Oh man. Senna's death led to a significant period of introspection within Formula 1, with questions being raised about the standards of safety of the circuits and the cars. His funeral in Brazil was a national event and was attended by over 500,000 people. The aftermath prompted a major overhaul in safety regulations. Innovations such as improved crash barriers and the HANDS, which is the head and neck support device, became mandatory. Legal proceedings ensued following the incident. Williams, the team for which Senna drove for, found themselves at the center of a manslaughter case, which examined whether or not technical issues or negligence had played a role in the crash. Ultimately, after years of investigations and trials, all charged parties were acquitted. This moment in time marked a big change in the way that safety was viewed in Formula 1, and Ayrton Senna's death would be the last death in Formula 1 for many, many years. So that's the controversial Grand Prix starter pack out of the way, and now we descend. The 2021 Belgian Grand Prix. This was the 12th round of the 2021 season and is infamous for being the shortest race ever run in the history of Formula 1. The race was planned to run for 44 laps, but was delayed multiple times due to the persistent rain. After over 3 hours of delays, the race would finally start behind the safety car and from the pit lane. Then after 3 laps, the race was ended as the conditions were still too severe to continue. Regulations required that results be taken from the end of lap 1, and all drivers within the top 10 were awarded half points, the first time half points had been given out since the 2009 Malaysian Grand Prix. Race director and fellow Australian Michael Massey was once again under the microscope for his handling of the race. Drivers and teams questioned the decision to award half points, with some calling it unjust and others defending the decision. Lewis Hamilton and other drivers viewed the race as a farce, suggesting that the laps were only completed to meet the minimum requirements for awarding points, and he called for a refund for the spectators. And despite initial discussions regarding the compensation of the spectators, the race promoters ultimately decided against refunding the tickets. And so you had hundreds of thousands of spectators who sat out in the cold, freezing rain, paid good money, and didn't really get to see a race. The 1976 Japanese Grand Prix. This was the 16th and final race of the 1976 season and was held at the Fuji Speedway. Going into the race, Niki Lauda was just 3 points ahead of James Hunt in the Drivers' Championship after a season full of incidents, including Lauda's near-fatal accident. On race day, the weather was very wet, with fog and running water at several different places on the track. Despite intense debates on whether or not the track was safe enough to race on, the race went ahead anyways. Niki Lauda, prioritizing his safety, famously withdrew from the race, stating that, quote, My life is worth more than a title. On the other hand, James Hunt would stay in the race and he took an early lead. As the race progressed and the track dried, Hunt's initially comfortable lead was threatened and tyre issues caused him to pit and fall behind. Despite the setbacks, Hunt managed to claw his way back to third position after a series of dramatic overtakes, and ultimately he scored just enough points to clinch the driver's title in a confusion-filled finale that wrapped up one of the most dramatic seasons in the history of Formula One. If you want to know more on the Niki Lauda and James Hunt rivalry of the 1970s, I do recommend the Ron Howard directed film Rush that has Chris Hemsworth as James Hunt and the guy from Inglourious Bastards as Niki Lauda. I forget what his name is. The 1994 Australian Grand Prix. This was the final race of the 1994 season, and going into it, the Drivers' Championship was on a knife edge, with Benetton's Michael Schumacher just 1 point ahead of Williams' Damon Hill in the championship. And no surprise, the race has become infamous for a collision between Schumacher and Hill. Schumacher would take the lead at the start of the race with Damon Hill in second place, and the order would remain this way until lap 36. However, Hill was beginning to catch up. Schumacher now found himself under pressure and he went off the track at the East Terrace corner and hit the wall with his right side wheels. It became immediately clear that Schumacher's car had sustained some serious damage as he re-entered the track. And I mean like potentially race-ending damage. At the next corner, Hill attempted to overtake Schumacher on the inside line, in a decision that I am certain still haunts Damon Hill to this very day. Schumacher reacted to this by turning in on Hill, and they both collided. And I'm going to say it, I think Schumacher knew what he was doing. Now, Schumacher's car was taken out on the spot. Hill attempted to continue the race and would go to the pits for repairs. However, it became clear that the damage sustained to his suspension's front left wishbone was irreparable, and he had to retire from the race as well. The net result of this incident is that Michael Schumacher became the 1994 World Drivers' Champion and was Germany's first ever world champion at age 25. The incident was controversial, with Schumacher facing criticism and accusations of deliberately causing the crash, though he was not penalized after race stewards deemed it a racing incident. Damon Hill would later openly accuse Schumacher of deliberate foul play. One theory is that Williams didn't protest the result because they just didn't want to draw any more attention to the team, not after the controversial spotlight they were put under following the death of Ayrton Senna earlier that season. And it makes sense. The 1997 European Grand Prix. This was the 17th and final race of the 1997 season. Going into the race, Ferrari's Michael Schumacher led the Drivers' Championship by just 1 point ahead of Williams driver Jacques Villeneuve. During an unprecedented qualifying session, Villeneuve, Schumacher, and Heinz-Harald Frentzen all set identical lap times, a first in Formula One history, and it has never happened since either. Villeneuve secured pole position by virtue of setting the time first, with Schumacher right alongside him in second place. Fast forward to lap 48 of the race and Michael Schumacher is leading. However, Villeneuve is less than 1 second behind him. Partway into the lap, Villeneuve attempted to overtake Schumacher at the sharp right-hand dry sack corner. Braking later than Schumacher, Villeneuve held the inside line and was ahead of Schumacher on track when Michael turned in on him. While Villeneuve narrowly missed sustaining major damage and was able to continue on with his race, the same could not be said for Michael Schumacher, who ended up in the gravel and had to retire the race. Martin Brundle, in the commentary box alongside Murray Walker, immediately saw that Michael's move had been deliberate, saying, quote, "That didn't work, Michael. You hit the wrong part of him, my friend." Villeneuve finished in third place and he won the Drivers' Championship of 1997. The incident was initially deemed a racing incident and no action was taken against Schumacher, but the media and public saw it differently. They saw it as a deliberate attempt to take out his competitor and drew parallels to the collision with Damon Hill in 1994. The FIA later deemed Schumacher's actions deliberate but not premeditated, disqualifying him from the 1997 standings. This decision stripped him of his second place finish. The aftermath of this incident saw Schumacher's reputation tarnished internationally. I mean, it was in the gutter. The German and Italian press in particular criticized him heavily. In Ferrari's post-race press conference, Schumacher did acknowledge his mistake. However, he said that it was a misjudgment and not a malicious act. I'll let you be the judge. The 1982 South African Grand Prix. So going into the race weekend, FISA, who was the governing body of Formula One at the time, had introduced new superlicense conditions that many of the drivers felt uncomfortable with. They were particularly concerned with clauses that they felt would tie them to their current teams and restrict their movement between other teams, and then just speaking out against FISA in general. The drivers, led by Niki Lauda and Didier Pironi, all got together at a nearby hotel to discuss the situation, and they ultimately decided, hey, why don't we just all go on strike? However, after negotiations and under the threat of potentially losing their super licenses, most of the drivers ended up competing anyways. The 2022 Japanese Grand Prix. So there were like two controversies surrounding this event, and it would also be the Grand Prix where Max Verstappen won his second world championship. The first controversy had to do with the awarding of points. If you remember, the race began under torrential rain, and it would be red flagged on lap 2 after Carlos Sainz aquaplaned and went into the barriers. And then after 2 hours of waiting, the race was resumed. Only 28 laps of the race could be completed because it went over the 3-hour time limit. As less than 75% of the race was completed, most of the paddock was under the impression that full points would not be awarded, and that would leave Max just 1 point shy of securing his second World Drivers' Championship. Even Verstappen himself expressed surprise when he discovered in the cool-down room that full points had been awarded, and therefore he was the World Drivers' Champion of 2022. Honestly, great scenes. But because of some very specific wording in the regulations, the procedure was to award all drivers full points. The second controversy has to do with the unsafe deployment and positioning of a recovery vehicle on the track after Pierre Gasly narrowly missed hitting it due to poor visibility, stating that he could have killed himself had he lost control of the vehicle, even at reduced speeds. This incident was reminiscent to that 8 years prior, at the same circuit in which Jules Bianchi suffered fatal injuries after crashing into a recovery vehicle. And now we segue. The 2014 Japanese Grand Prix. This was the 15th race of the 2014 season and is remembered for being the race that took the life of driver Jules Bianchi and would lead to significant safety reforms in the sport. The race was affected by heavy rain due to Typhoon Fanphone, but despite the conditions, the race would still continue behind the safety car. On lap 43 of the race, and in worsening weather conditions, Bianchi lost control of his car and collided with a tractor crane that was being used to remove the Sauber of Adrian Sutil, who had crashed in the same spot the previous lap. The low profile of the crane resulted in Bianchi's car going under the crane, and this caused devastating head injuries to the driver. After remaining in a coma for 9 months, Bianchi succumbed to his injuries and passed away on July 17th, 2015. His death was the first that Formula One had experienced due to a race incident since Ayrton Senna's death all the way back in 1994. Bianchi's crash served as the catalyst for new safety standards, including the introduction of the virtual safety car, the VSC, and most notably the introduction of the Halo, which at this point has saved the lives of so many drivers. And it's just a shame that the Halo wasn't a device that existed in the era that Bianchi was driving in, because it very well could have saved his life. The 2023 Qatar Grand Prix. So this was the 17th race of the current 2023 season and was overshadowed by two controversies relating to tyre safety and extreme heat conditions. Firstly, the integrity of the Pirelli tyres was called into question following damage observed from the circuit's curbs. Previous tyre failures from 2021 had already raised red flags, and so in a sort of unprecedented fashion, changes were made to the track limits during the race weekend. Further concerns led to the FIA imposing a maximum of 18 laps per tyre set, which is a safety precaution that had never been seen before in F1. Secondly, the race was run under extreme heat conditions, with several drivers saying that it was literally the most difficult race they have ever experienced. Esteban Ocon vomited in his car twice, and he still managed to finish in 7th place, while Logan Sargent would retire due to heat stroke and dehydration. Sargent's teammate, Alexander Albon, was sent to the medical center after the race as well due to heat exposure. Lance Stroll also went directly to the medical center after the race, after he said he was literally passing out in his car and suffering from blurred vision. And there's footage of Lance getting out of his car after the race and literally fainting. George Russell said that he was close to losing consciousness towards the end of the race. And you begin to wonder how the race was even allowed to go ahead under such extreme conditions. Afterwards, controversy surrounded the decision to run the race at all, like I just said, with people citing that races had been red flagged in the past for much less. And I think that F1 got really lucky that nothing more major happened and all the drivers ended up being okay in the end, because it could have gone a lot worse. The 2013 British Grand Prix. This was the 8th round of the 2013 season, and this one is a little bit crazy. Like, in my brain, it is the race of exploding tires. Literally. Going into the race, Lewis Hamilton qualified on pole position with Nico Rosberg in 2nd place and Sebastian Vettel in 3rd. Hamilton had a great start and he made a quick getaway into the lead. The problems began on lap 8 when race leader Lewis Hamilton's left rear tire basically exploded on the Wellington Straight, and this caused him to pit from 1st position, and when he rejoined the race, he was all the way back in 22nd. Just one lap later, Felipe Massa would experience a similar fate when his left rear tire failed at the entry corner, and this dropped him from 4th place to 22nd place. Then on lap 14, Jean-Eric Vergne's left rear tire failed on the hangar straight at 180 miles per hour, resulting in a safety car. And as the race progressed, concerns over tyre safety grew. Pirelli technicians advised teams to increase tyre pressures and to avoid the curbs. Despite these precautions, there were still more tyre-related incidents. On lap 28, Esteban Gutierrez experienced a front left tyre failure, and on lap 46, Checo experienced a high-speed left rear tyre failure, which would force his retirement from the race. And if you watch the race highlights, the tyres are literally exploding, and I'm not exaggerating. These events led to a series of safety car periods and pit stops, which just continued to shuffle the race order. And after the race concluded, people were like, Pirelli, what? The net result of this is investigations that led to changes in tyre construction and regulations. The 1976 German Grand Prix. So this was the 10th race of the 1976 season and was the very last Formula One race to ever be held at the Nordschleife section of the Nürburgring. And it would be the scene of reigning world champion Niki Lauda's near-fatal accident. The circuit's extraordinary size meant that it needed at least 5 times the number of marshals and medical staff to properly maintain it. And this was something that the German organizers just, quite frankly, were unable to provide. It was very narrow, had few runoff areas, and many sections of the track were nearly inaccessible to fire marshals. It was also very bumpy, and at numerous points in the track, cars would actually become airborne, which doesn't sound safe at all. For these reasons, it had been decided going into the race that after nearly half a century, this would be the last German Grand Prix to be held at the old Nürburgring. Defending world champion Niki Lauda was concerned about the conditions, and so he tried to arrange a boycott of the race, but it was voted against by the other drivers by just 1 vote, and so the race went ahead. Now, if we fast forward into the race, after switching tyres, Niki Lauda was aggressively making up time, but then his Ferrari veered right and crashed into an embankment before his car burst into flames on the track. Guy Edwards narrowly missed the wreck, but Brett Lunger and Harold Ertel would collide with Lauda's car. The trio, along with Arturo Mazzario, who had pulled over to assist, fought to rescue Lauda from the inferno. And this is just sort of how it was back then. In a lot of these famous crashes, it was up to the drivers to rescue their fellow drivers from the wreck. The safety just was not where it is today. There is something kind of beautiful about the camaraderie of the drivers in these extreme situations. At least I think so. Lauda sustained critical burns and he was airlifted to hospital where he remained in critical condition for several days. And had it not been for the efforts of his fellow drivers, Niki Lauda would have most likely died that day on the Nordschleife. The 2007 Hungarian Grand Prix. This was the 11th race of the 2007 season and is infamous for an incident that occurred during Saturday qualifying between McLaren teammates Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso. And if you know anything about the 2007 season, you know that it was drama-filled, with most of it centering around the McLaren team. You had one of the greatest teammate rivalries ever between Lewis Hamilton in his rookie season, which is also just the greatest rookie season ever in the sport, and the legend himself, two-time reigning world champion Fernando Alonso. It was also the year of Spygate, so yeah, it was all happening at McLaren. Going into the race, Lewis Hamilton was leading the championship, but only just, as he had a 2-point advantage over his teammate Fernando Alonso. The controversy began during qualifying when Lewis Hamilton failed to honor an agreement to let Fernando Alonso past him on the track, and this denied Alonso a competitive advantage when setting his time. And Alonso, he would not let this slide. During Q3, Alonso pitted for fresh tyres along with most of the other cars on the track. And at the time, Lewis was stacked behind Alonso in the pits. And Lewis had to wait for Alonso to leave the pit box before he could go in there and get fresh tyres himself. But when Alonso was released, he didn't leave the pit box. He remained stationary for another 10 seconds, despite the fact that the pit crews were gesturing for him to leave because they needed to get Lewis in. Alonso eventually left and Lewis would get his fresh tyres, but the delay meant that there was insufficient time for Lewis to get back to the start-finish line before the checkered flag. And so Lewis was just unable to set a lap. Alonso started his flying lap with less than 2 seconds in the session, and Lewis missed out by 5 seconds. Alonso's final lap was good enough to put him on pole position, and this pushed Lewis down to second place. However, after the race, Alonso was handed a 5-place grid penalty, which would mean that he would start from 6th and Lewis would end up being bumped to pole position. And then, strangely, the FIA decided to disqualify McLaren from scoring any constructors' points for this race. And this was just one of a very long list of conflicts that tainted the 2007 season for McLaren. And it would end in Spygate, so yeah. The 2008 Belgian Grand Prix. So this was the 13th race of the 2008 season. Lewis Hamilton qualified on pole position, but after a spin in the second lap, Kimi Raikkonen would go on to take the lead of the race. Then during the closing laps of the race, Lewis Hamilton, who was racing for McLaren, engaged in a tight battle with Ferrari's Kimi Raikkonen. And if you look it up on YouTube, it's awesome. On lap 42, under wet conditions, Hamilton cut the chicane at the bus stop, gaining a competitive advantage that allowed him to overtake Raikkonen. Lewis initially gave the position back to comply with the rules, only to overtake Raikkonen immediately in the next corner. And then on the following lap, Raikkonen crashed out of the race and retired. The final laps of this race, really fantastic. You've got Lewis on dry tires and he's having to tiptoe around the track in order not to spin out. And eventually he crosses the line in first place. However, after the race, the stewards deemed that Lewis Hamilton had gained an unfair advantage by cutting that chicane at the bus stop, despite yielding the position back to Raikkonen momentarily. So they handed Hamilton a 25-second penalty, because back then this was the minimum penalty. They didn't have 5 or 10-second penalties back then. It was 25 seconds or nothing. This penalty demoted Hamilton from first place to third place and promoted Felipe Massa to the winning position. The decision was widely debated, with many in the Formula One community arguing about the consistency and fairness of penalties within the sport. McLaren appealed the decision, but the FIA upheld the stewards' ruling, confirming Massa as the winner of the race. This incident intensified discussions about the consistency of regulations and stewarding as a whole in Formula One. The 1984 Monaco Grand Prix. This was the 6th race of the 1984 season, and it would be the only race that season that was run in wet weather conditions. Alain Prost qualified on pole, and on lap 29 he was leading the race. During the race, Prost, who began to feel like the conditions were too dangerous to continue, started to signal to the stewards suggesting that the race be stopped. At the same time, a then rookie Ayrton Senna was making an incredible charge. He had qualified in 13th position, and in a generally uncompetitive car, which was the Tolman, Senna made his way up to second place. And each lap, Senna was closing the gap between himself and Prost by about 3 to 5 seconds, which is ludicrous. Just as it seemed inevitable that Senna would take the lead of the race, on lap 32, race clerk Jackie Ickx controversially red flagged the race. Now, Senna had overtaken Prost by the time that the red flag had been waved, but because of the regulations, the positions would be reverted back to when Prost was leading the previous lap. Jackie Ickx faced suspension for not consulting the other stewards before halting the race, in a decision that some saw as favouring Alain Prost. Senna's performance, marked by setting the fastest lap of the race, highlighted his prowess in wet conditions and would just go down as one of the most legendary drives in history, despite the fact that he didn't win the race. And that is layer 2 done and dusted. So now we can descend. The 2006 Monaco Grand Prix. This was the 7th round of the 2006 season and is infamous for Michael Schumacher's actions during the closing stages of qualifying, in which he just stopped his car at the Rascasse corner, thus preventing his rival Fernando Alonso from improving his time. Schumacher maintained that this was an innocent mistake. However, stewards would deem it a deliberate action after review of his telemetry data. Schumacher's actions were almost unanimously condemned by all other drivers and TV pundits, who noted that he had a history of dirty tactics, some of which we've discussed today. Now, Alonso went on to win the race, but in an incredible drive, Schumacher went from the very back of the grid to finish in 5th position. And this is at Monaco too, which is a track that is notorious for being very, very difficult to overtake on. Also, this is the race where Kimi Raikkonen's car broke down on lap 51 from 2nd place. And instead of returning to the pits, he walked to his yacht, took his shirt off, and drank beer with his friends while he watched the end of the race. If you haven't seen this, check it out. The 2019 Canadian Grand Prix. This was the 7th race of the 2019 season, and the controversy centered around an incident involving Ferrari's Sebastian Vettel and Mercedes' Lewis Hamilton on lap 48 of the race. Sebastian Vettel was leading the race, having started from pole position, with Lewis Hamilton following closely behind in 2nd. Then on lap 48, Vettel, who was under pressure from Hamilton, made a mistake at the turn 3-4 chicane. He went off into the grass at turn 4, and as he rejoined the track, he almost collided with Hamilton, who was going for a gap on the outside. After reviewing the footage, the stewards issued a 5-second time penalty to Sebastian Vettel for rejoining the track in an unsafe manner and for forcing another driver off the track. Now, Vettel crossed the line in 1st place, but due to this 5-second time penalty, Lewis Hamilton, who was closely behind, would be classified the winner of the race. This decision was met with significant controversy, and Vettel himself was visibly upset, criticizing the decision, saying that he didn't have anywhere else to go when he rejoined the track. Many fans and even some of the drivers believed that the penalty was too harsh and that it spoiled the race. It was made even more painful by the fact that, despite coming close, Vettel had failed to win a single race that season, and he thought that this would be his first win. And once again, this controversy fueled those discussions about the consistency of stewarding in F1. However, the decision stood and Hamilton's victory would remain on the record. The 1998 British Grand Prix. This was the 9th race of that season and is famous for being the race that Michael Schumacher won from the pit lane. And if you are anything like me, you're probably wondering, how does that work? Now, Mika Hakkinen had established a very comfortable lead from pole position. As the wet Silverstone circuit began to dry, Ferrari's gamble on tyre strategy began to pay off, and Schumacher began to close that gap. But then, on lap 43, the yellow flags were waved because Jacques Villeneuve had spun off into the gravel trap. Now, under these conditions, the race stewards noticed that Schumacher had overtaken the Benetton of Alexander Wurz. Because Because of this, on lap 59 of 60, Schumacher was handed a 10-second stop and go penalty. On the final lap, Schumacher entered the pit lane to serve his penalty, but because of the way that the circuit was laid out at the time, the starting line was a bit further back than it is today. Schumacher had actually crossed the start-finish line before entering his penalty box. Now, McLaren stated that Ferrari had cheated, and Ferrari said, hey, we were given the penalty way too late in the race. In the end, turns out that the stewards totally messed up, and they gave the penalty to Schumacher way too late in the race. So in the end, it was revoked entirely. With all of that being said, Schumacher was 22 seconds ahead of Mika Hakkinen at the end of the race. So even if the penalty had stuck, he still would have won. So yeah, this one's a strange one. The 1999 Malaysian Grand Prix. This was the 15th and penultimate race of the 1999 season. So for context, earlier that season in the 1999 British Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher experienced a brake failure that sent him into the barriers and resulted in a broken leg. Schumacher would go on to miss the next 6 races due to this injury, but he would return for the 1999 Malaysian Grand Prix, with just 2 races to go. At this point, Schumacher had missed so many races that he could no longer fight for the driver's title. So at this point, he turned his focus to helping his Ferrari teammate, Eddie Irvine, who was in a very close title fight with McLaren's Mika Hakkinen. And after returning in goated form, Schumacher would set pole position by a full second. The race that followed was a brilliant showmanship of teamwork as Schumacher defended against the McLarens to help his teammate Irvine win the race with a Ferrari 1-2. In the press conference that followed, Eddie Irvine famously said about Schumacher, quote, "Not only is he the best number 1, but he's also the best number 2. But then, immediately after the race, both Ferraris would be disqualified for an infringement relating to their barge boards. Now, had this disqualification stuck, it would have been disastrous to Ferrari, as it would have effectively given McLaren both the Constructors and Drivers' Championship by default. However, Ferrari appealed against the FIA's decision in court, arguing that the barge boards did not provide a significant performance advantage and that the discrepancies were within the manufacturing tolerances. And then the FIA were like, okay, we uphold your appeal, and both drivers were reinstated their points. This would put Ferrari ahead of McLaren in the Constructors by 4 points, and Irvine ahead of Mika Hakkinen by 4 points as well. Unfortunately for Eddie Irvine, in the next and final round in Japan, Mika Hakkinen would finish in first place, and ultimately, he won the Drivers' Championship for that season. The 2009 Malaysian Grand Prix. This was the second race of the 2009 season and has been dubbed by the Formula One YouTube channel as potentially the wettest race ever, ? Under looming storm clouds, Braun GP's Jenson Button would start from pole position. After the race commenced in dry conditions, heavy rain began to fall a few laps in, significantly impacting visibility and track conditions. So many teams began to scramble and started to pit for wet weather tires. As the rain intensified, with several drivers aquaplaning and going off of the track, the race would be red flagged by officials after 31 laps. Now, this was just over the halfway point of the race, which was the minimum distance for a race to be considered official by the FIA regulations at the time. After the red flags, there was about an hour delay while officials waited for a break in the weather. But with fans becoming increasingly frustrated and the daylight fading at a circuit that didn't have any floodlights, the officials eventually decided to abandon the race. Since the race reached beyond the halfway mark, but did not complete 75% of the scheduled race distance, half points would be awarded for the first time since the 1991 Australian Grand Prix. This meant that Jenson Button, who was leading at the time of the stoppage, would win the race, but he would only receive half the points that you would usually get for a victory. This situation prompted discussions about the rescheduling of the Malaysian Grand Prix and whether or not floodlights should be implemented at the track. And while fans were disappointed, the decision to abandon the race was almost unanimously backed by the drivers. The 2021 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. This was the 21st race of the season, and it was embroiled in controversy primarily due to incidents involving Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. All of this being heightened by the fact that this was the second last race in a neck-to-neck title fight where every point counted. On lap 10, a major crash involving Mick Schumacher would bring out the red flag and prompt a restart. Racing resumed with a standing start, but after another collision collision involving Sergio Perez, Nicky Mazepin, and George Russell, the race would be red flagged and restarted a second time. On the second restart, Max overtook Hamilton off the track and thus gained an advantage. Red Bull was instructed that Verstappen give the place back to Hamilton. On lap 37, while preparing to give first place back to Hamilton, Verstappen slowed down on the main straight. Hamilton, unaware of Verstappen's intentions, collided with the back of the Red Bull and both cars took on damage. Despite this, it was insignificant enough that they were still both able to continue with the race. Verstappen was later handed a 10-second penalty for this incident. On lap 42, after a series of contentious overtakes, Verstappen was instructed once more to give the place back to Hamilton, which he did. However, after Hamilton overtook Verstappen immediately repassed Hamilton. It was at this time that Verstappen was handed another penalty, this time a 5-second one. All of these penalties massively impacted the result of the race, which was critical as it affected the standings in the championships. And despite all of the penalties, Verstappen still managed to finish in second place. Both the team principals and the drivers criticized it publicly. And once again, Michael Masi was under the spotlight. And this was just one race before the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which we discussed all the way back at the start of this iceberg. The 2014 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. This was the final and title deciding race of this season. And as you can see, there's a bit of a trend here. Final title deciding race, controversy follows, yada yada. Going into the weekend, Mercedes' Lewis Hamilton was leading the Drivers' Championship over his teammate Nico Rosberg, who was just behind in second place. Now, the really strange and debated part of this race has to do with the introduction of a new point system that was in place just for this final race and this final race only. For the first time in Formula One history, teams and drivers would score double points for their positions in the race. The FIA's reasoning for this was to maximize focus on the championship until the end of the season. So basically, the FIA was artificially trying to make F1 more spicy. Now, the original plan was going to be for double points to be awarded for the last 3 races of the season, but the teams pushed back and were like, no, that's garbage. So the compromise was that double points would only be awarded for the very last race of the season, which, still, why? Under this new double point structure, Lewis Hamilton would have to finish either first or second to guarantee the championship, whereas under the regular point structure, which is the same one that we use today, he would have only needed to finish 6th. And then Nico Rosberg qualified on pole position, and the pressure was now on for Lewis. Lewis would get a lightning getaway at the start of the race, and he overtook Rosberg for first place. On lap 25 of the race, Rosberg had fallen 7.1 seconds behind Lewis Hamilton, and his team informed him that his ERS system had failed. This ERS issue effectively killed Rosberg's race, as the ERS system accounts for about 160 horsepower. Rosberg dropped down to 14th, and Lewis Hamilton would win his second World Drivers' Championship, and his first with Mercedes, marking the beginning of the Mercedes era of hybrid dominance. Rosberg entered the cooldown room to congratulate Lewis after a season-long rivalry, and he acknowledged that the ERS problem didn't really make a difference in the championship, since Lewis would have had to have finished lower than 3rd for him to have a chance of winning anyways. Still, racing fans were very unhappy with the introduction of this new double point system, and of course they would be. It's a horrible idea. And thus, the double point system was scrapped for the next season to never ever return to Formula One. Seriously, never bring it back. The 2009 Belgian Grand Prix. So this was the 12th race of the 2009 season. After researching it, I couldn't really figure out what the controversy was. The reason I think it's on the iceberg is because this race happens right before the news about Crashgate broke and went public, and then Renault was subsequently disqualified from Formula One. So yeah, if there's more to it, please let me know in the comments below. And do check out Fisichello's pole position lap, because it is so cool. The 2002 Malaysian Grand Prix. This was the second race of the 2002 season and is notable for a first lap collision between Williams' Juan Pablo Montoya and Ferrari's Michael Schumacher. Schumacher qualified on pole position with Montoya in second place. At the race start, Schumacher immediately cut across the front of Montoya, forcing him to brake to avoid collision. However, at the first corner, Montoya had managed to outbrake him and was now alongside Schumacher in the corner. As the Ferrari and the Williams took the corner, Schumacher's Ferrari experienced understeer and he crashed into Montoya's car, resulting in the Ferrari's front wing coming off. Montoya then ran wide briefly, resulting in Rubens Barrichello taking the lead of the race. Schumacher had to pit for a new front wing, and then on lap 7, Montoya was handed a drive-through penalty for an incident that wasn't even his fault really. And this would cost Montoya 20 seconds. The decision to penalise Montoya was met with a host of criticism, and rightfully so. The head steward of the event had a history of making strange decisions, and previously he'd actually had his licence for stewarding suspended for an entire year following his decision in the 1998 British Grand Prix when Michael Schumacher won from the pit lane. Even Michael Schumacher commented that the penalty was overly harsh, and once again, stewards making bad decisions, surprise, surprise. The 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix. This was the third round of the 2003 season and is infamous just for the sheer level of chaos that it produced and for the controversial finish in heavy rain. So, a lot happened in this race. So please bear with me as I try to condense it into a nice, neat summary. For the 2003 season, a brand new regulation mandated that tyre manufacturers, which in this case was Michelin and Bridgestone at the time, could only supply their teams with one wet compound for the entire race weekend. So that could either be the intermediate or it could be the full wet. Now I just want to say, this rule stinks. And if you can make the case for it being a good idea, please let me know, because I'm genuinely curious as to why this was even a thing. So going into the race, all the Bridgestone runners were supplied with the intermediate tyre, whereas Michelin went in the opposite direction and decided to supply their teams with the full wet compound. The race started under wet conditions with Brazilian driver Rubens Barrichello on pole position. Now, a little bit of context here, but Rubens Barrichello had grown up just 2 streets over from the Interlagos circuit, and he was Brazil's most loved driver at the time. And since he had started racing the Brazilian Grand Prix in 1993, he had only ever finished the entire race once. And that was in 1994 when he finished 4th. All the other races leading up until that point, he either had an accident or, more likely, his car just broke down. He seemed to be cursed. It was like he could never win his home Grand Prix. But here we are, it's 2003 and Rubens Barrichello finds himself on pole position at his home circuit. After a 15-minute delay had been called due to the wet conditions, the race would finally begin behind the safety car. Throughout the first half of the race, the intensity of the rain had increased, and this would result in multiple restarts and several drivers being taken out, including Michael Schumacher, Olivier Panis, Ralph Furman, and Juan Pablo Montoya. The runners who were on wet tyres found themselves at an advantage, and the Bridgestone runners who were on the intermediate tyres were really struggling at this point in the race, and that includes Ferrari, which is the team that Rubens Barrichello drove for. But by lap 45, the track had begun to dry, and this flipped the script entirely, and now the intermediate Bridgestone tyres were clearly the tyres to be on. Barrichello overtook David Coulthard and took the lead of his home Grand Prix. And with how the Bridgestone tyres were holding up, the race was now there, in Barrichello's grasp, finally, after all of these years. And then 2 laps later, he ran out of fuel and pulled over on the side of the track. Yep. And once again, he was smited by the racing gods. It's now lap 52, and the front runners are McLaren's Kimi Räikkönen in first place, and in second place is Jordan's Giancarlo Fisichella. Incredibly, Fisichella had driven the absolute wheels off his tractor of a Jordan, and on lap 53, after Kimi Räikkönen ran wide, Fisichella would take the lead of the race. So many lead changes in this race. The very next lap, Mark Webber crashed, followed by Fernando Alonso crashing into a tyre from Mark Webber's car at an impact measured to be 60 Gs. The red flags were out, and after this, the race would not be restarted. Fisichella finished lap 55 in first place, and all cars subsequently returned to the pit lane. As Fisichella drove into the pit lane with victory in his heart, his car caught on fire, because why not? Now, because of some regulation mumbo jumbo and a literal error with the timekeeping itself, the results were taken from 3 laps before Alonso's crash. 3 laps before Alonso's crash, Kimi Raikkonen was leading the race. If they had done it properly and taken the results from 2 laps before Alonso's crash, well then, Fisichella was leading the race. So as the Jordan team was celebrating, they were informed that they had not actually won, and first place was given to Kimi Raikkonen. But then, in another twist, the FIA actually got something right, and after Jordan appealed in court, Fisichella was handed back his win. And this resulted in like this sort of cute makeshift ceremony in Imola, where Kimi Raikkonen would hand the trophy back to Fisichella. And you've got to give it to Kimi, he was a really good sport about this. The 2011 British Grand Prix. This was the 9th race of the 2011 season, and the controversy has to do with off-throttle blown diffusers. So going into the weekend, the FIA banned this off-throttle blown diffuser concept that some of the teams had been using. By manipulating engine maps, teams were able to keep exhaust gases blowing over the diffuser pretty much constantly. This concept gave cars slightly more downforce at the rear, and some estimates go as far as to say that this concept could shave a full second off lap time. So it's a pretty big deal. This change would affect the Red Bull the most, as the RB7 had been designed entirely around this concept, whereas other teams had simply added it after the fact when they saw just how quick the Red Bull was. And then there was this brief moment where the FIA said that cars with Renault-powered engines would not be fully affected by this change and they would get concessions, but then Mercedes complained and then the FIA backtracked. So basically, going into the race, the blown diffuser was banned and all teams were now on a level playing field. This whole ban on blown diffusers allowed the non-exhaust blown Ferrari of Fernando Alonso to win the race. And then after the race weekend, there was so much backlash that the FIA just said, screw this, you can have your blown diffusers back, and it was allowed for the rest of the season. But the FIA would eventually get its way, and going into the next season, they just straight up banned blown diffusers. The 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix. This was the 13th race of the 1989 season, and the controversy has to do with Nigel Mansell potentially really hindering Ayrton Senna's title-winning chances that year. During the middle of the race, Mansell came into the pits slightly too fast and he missed his pit box by several meters after he locked his tires up. Although his pit crew moved down the pit lane to try to change Mansell's tyres where he was, Mansell engaged his reverse gear and drove backwards a short distance to the correct spot. However, according to the regulations, driving a car in reverse in the pit lane is expressly forbidden. If a team wanted to do this legally, the pit crew would have to physically push the car backwards, but you could not engage the reverse gear. So following this incident, Mansell was given the black disqualification flag. At the start of lap 48 and approaching turn 1, and even while the black flag was being waved at him, Mansell attempted to overtake Senna. The cars, as so often was the case, collided and they were both taken out of the race. This incident massively hurt Senna's title chances, especially since his rival Alain Prost had finished in second place during this race. Now, it has been argued about who was at fault for the crash, and after watching the footage like multiple times, I mean, Senna does go for a very aggressive line when trying to overtake, but the reason that it's so controversial is because these cars shouldn't have even been in that position in the first place, because Mansell shouldn't have even been racing. He was disqualified, he should have retired to the pit lane, but alas, he did not. The 2022 British Grand Prix. This was the 10th race of the 2022 season and is famous for one of the most shocking crashes in the history of Formula One, in which Zhou Guanyu's car flipped over, skidded down the track for a fair distance, and was then launched into the barriers. Remarkably, Zhou walked away from this incident without major injury, and it can safely be said that the halo probably saved his life that day. However, the roll hoop in the car had failed, and it could have potentially trapped Zhou in the car had it landed upside down, but luckily that didn't happen. The other controversial happening in this race was barely shown in the original broadcast, and to be honest, it's probably for the best. During the suspension of the race, a group of protesters raided the track and sat down on the tarmac. Luckily, they were quickly dragged off the track and arrested by the police. And I don't think I have to say too much, but don't sit on the track. The fans who witnessed the protesters at the track let them know what they thought. They said some things that if I was monetized, which I'm not because I have 80 subscribers, but if I was, they would get me very much demonetized. But there are videos on YouTube if you're interested. The 1985 San Marino Grand Prix. This was the third race of the 1985 season and is famous for being the race where everybody just ran out of fuel, and the person who eventually won the race didn't even lead a single lap of it. Ayrton Senna would start from pole position, and after having led for most of the race, he, along with other top runners, would have to back off the pace in order to save fuel. And I mean like significantly back off the pace. This meant that the front cars were now vulnerable, in particular the Ferrari of Stefan Johansson. He had started the race in P15, but he had steadily been picking everybody off, and he now found himself in P4. And he was making some serious gains on the leaders. Over the next few laps, he made his way up to P2 and was steadily closing the gap between himself and Ayrton Senna. At this point, even some of the cars that were further back started to run out of fuel, including Derek Warwick and Martin Brundle. And then with 3 laps to go, and after leading for the entire race, Ayrton Senna ran out of fuel and pulled over on the side of the road. And Johansson took the lead. The Tifosi went wild. And then half a lap later, Johansson ran out of fuel and pulled over on the side of the road as well. His race was also over. Prost managed to take the checkered flag in first place, with Elio De Angelis in second. Prost celebrated his victory, but then 2 hours later, it was discovered that his car was 2 kilograms over the weight limit. And thus, Alain Prost was disqualified, leaving Elio De Angelis with the win despite having never even led a single lap of it. And out of the 25 drivers who started the race, only 5 would actually finish it. This race prompted discussions about the viability of the current regulations in Formula One, and it forced F1 to make changes to the regulations in regards to fuel. No surprise there. The 1985 Belgian Grand Prix. This race was the 13th round of the season, and it is controversial for the race being cancelled and rescheduled during the middle of the race weekend. Something that could never ever happen today. Basically, 10 days before the Grand Prix weekend, the track Spa had undergone a £3 million resurfacing, which was designed to improve the grip during wet weather conditions. But come the race weekend, those 1980s turbocharged F1 cars were quite literally tearing up the track and causing significant damage to it. This £3 million resurfacing was not holding up at all. Mid-race weekend, drivers representative Niki Lauda informed the press that the race would be postponed. Jean-Marie Balestre, the president of FISA, was furious, and the race organizers were fined $10,000 as well as an additional $100,000 bond in the event that the circuit was not ready for the rescheduled race. But just imagine this happening today, especially with the calendar as crowded as it is. It would be something. The 1984 Dallas Grand Prix. Did you know that Dallas had a one-off Grand Prix in the 80s? Because before I did this, I had no idea. This was the 9th race of the 1984 season, and it would be the only time that the Dallas Grand Prix would ever be run. But why was that the case? Well, going into the race weekend, it was hot. On Sunday, for the race, temperatures reached 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was hot enough that the track service began to do things that you really don't want a track service to do. In this case, disintegrate. Apparently, before qualifying, the track surface was bubbling, and a few laps in, it began to break apart. The surface was likened more to that of a rallycross track than a Grand Prix circuit. Brabham's Nelson Piquet reportedly wondered which would break first, the track or the drivers. The race was scheduled to start at 11 AM on Sunday, which was 3 hours earlier than usual because of the heat. Because a 50-lap Can-Am race on Saturday had damaged the circuit so badly, emergency repairs had been going on all night and all the way up until 30 minutes before the start of the Grand Prix. Niki Lauda and Alain Prost tried to arrange a boycott among the drivers, but KK Rosberg insisted that they should race, saying, quote, "I don't know what all the fuss is about." Pole position was taken by Nigel Mansell, who went on to lead the first half of the race. And by the end, only 8 of the 25 drivers who started the race actually managed to finish. The most famous and iconic scene from the entire weekend is after Nigel Mansell's Lotus broke down on the very last lap just before the checkered flag. He got out of his car and tried incredibly hard to push it across the line. But in the extreme heat, he fainted. The oppressive heat and poor track conditions played a major role as to why the Dallas Grand Prix was a one-off, and it would be replaced the following year by the Australian Grand Prix. F1 has since returned to Texas, with it hosting the United States Grand Prix since 2012 at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin. However, the race in Austin has always been held in either October or November, away from the Texan summer. So it's safe to say that the organizers learn a valuable lesson from this 1984 Dallas Grand Prix. The 1994 British Grand Prix. This was the 8th race of the season and was the race that Michael Schumacher managed to get himself disqualified from because he kept overtaking Damon Hill on the formation lap. On the first formation lap, Schumacher overtook Damon Hill twice before dropping back to second place. And if you don't know this already, overtaking on the formation lap is a big no-no. Then at the start of the race, David Coulthard stalled on the grid, and this resulted in a second formation lap. And what do you know? On this second formation lap, Schumacher overtook Damon Hill another 2 times. And then after failing to serve his penalty during the race, Schumacher was given the black flag, which is the disqualification flag. However, Schumacher just chose to ignore this and he kept racing. Initially, Schumacher was allowed to keep his second place, but the Benetton team was fined $25,000. But then on the 26th of July, the FIA increased that $25,000 fine to a $500,000 fine and gave Michael Schumacher a 2-race ban. And he was also stripped of his second place position from the British Grand Prix. Now, I'm not quite sure why Schumacher kept overtaking Hill on those formation laps, but if you know more than I do, please let me know in the comments below. Okay, so that is layer 3 all done and dusted, and now we move on to layer 4. And this is where some of the races start to take that dark turn. Hi, it is I, the future editor version of myself that is editing this video. And I'm currently putting together this monstrosity of a project, and I have realized I may have messed up just a little bit. Let me show you. So assuming that I'm still literate, this one here says 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix. Well, we begin with the 2008 Hungarian Grand Prix.
Excuse me? 2008? That says 2009. What?
So what's happened is, I think while I was writing the gigantic script for this video, I made a typo. Instead of writing 2009, I wrote 2008. So I researched, wrote the script, recorded and edited the wrong Grand Prix. So the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix has to do with a crash involving Felipe Massa during qualifying, in which a spring breaks off of the Brawn GP car of Rubens Barrichello, flies back, hits Massa in the helmet, knocks him unconscious, and then he drives headfirst at full speed into the tire wall. It's a really shocking crash, and a lot of people have sort of speculated that this race may have changed the course of Felipe Massa's career for the worse. If you want to see more about this video, I know I'm not meant to do this, but just watch this here. It covers it really well. And because I did the 2008 one, and it's still kind of interesting, and it is about Felipe Massa as well, strangely enough, I'm gonna leave that in. So yeah, back to it. We begin with the 2008 Hungarian Grand Prix. This was the 11th race of the 2008 season, and it's remembered for being one of those big what-if moments in Formula One. McLaren's Lewis Hamilton would start from pole position with his teammate Heikki Kovalainen in second and Ferrari's Felipe Massa in third position. Massa had a great jump off the line at the start of the race and would end up alongside Lewis Hamilton going into turn 1. Hamilton held the inside line for the turn, but Massa managed to outbrake him and would overtake Lewis for the lead with a really spectacular move on the outside. And on lap 3, both Massa and Hamilton began to pull away from Kovalainen, who was in 3rd place. By lap 18, Massa was 3.5 seconds ahead of Lewis Hamilton, who in turn was 8 seconds ahead of his teammate Kovalainen. At the front of the field, Massa continued to gradually pull away from Hamilton, and by lap 40, the gap was at 5 seconds. On the following lap, Hamilton's front left tyre deflated as he approached turn 2, and this slow lap back to the pits plus the pit stop itself would drop Lewis all the way back to 10th. And now with Hamilton out of the way, Massa had a 23-second lead ahead of Kovalainen, who was now in 2nd place. However, as Massa approached lap 68, his engine failed without warning, and this forced him to retire from the race after his incredible drive with just 3 laps remaining. Kovalainen was thus promoted to the lead, and he would take his very first victory in Formula 1. The podium finishes were really overshadowed by the media's coverage of the ill fortunes of both Lewis Hamilton and Felipe Massa during the Grand Prix. Massa in particular was praised for his performance, with the Ferrari team principal at the time, Stefano Domenicali, saying that, quote, "It was the best race of his career. It was fantastic the way he managed the race." Journalist Mark Hughes described it as almost certainly his best race to date. But despite his incredible drive, Massa did not take away any points from this race as he DNF'd. It's been speculated that if Massa's Ferrari had made it to the finish line, he could have very well won the Drivers' Championship for 2008, which he ended up losing to Lewis Hamilton by just a single point. And with the way that Massa's been going about things lately, I wouldn't be surprised if this race is like a reoccurring nightmare that he has, along with the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. The 1982 San Marino Grand Prix. This was the 4th race of the 1982 season and is infamous for a falling out between Ferrari teammates Didier Pironi and Gilles Villeneuve. And going into the weekend, some of the teams were planning on boycotting the race in this thing that was known as the FISA versus FOCA war. But I don't want to open that can of worms because we could really spend a lot of time there, but just know that there's some drama going on in the background as well. Now, fast forward towards the end of the race, and both of the Ferraris were leading by a pretty significant margin. And so Ferrari ordered both of their drivers to slow the pace down in order to save fuel and reduce risk of a mechanical failure. Villeneuve also believed that this order meant for both of the cars to maintain their position on the track, with Villeneuve being ahead of Pironi at the time that the team order was given. But on the other hand, Pironi believed that the cars were still free to race, and so he overtook Villeneuve. Initially, Villeneuve thought, oh, Pironi's just trying to put on a show for the fans and he's just trying to spice up this dull race, but it's okay. I'll repass him and then we'll maintain position. And so Villeneuve duly repassed Pironi and he assumed that they would hold and maintain their positions until the end of the Grand Prix. Thus, Villeneuve was just cruising along on the final lap, thinking that there was an understanding between the Ferrari drivers, and he failed to protect his inside line on the Tosa corner when Pironi passed him to take the win. Villeneuve was very upset about this, and he felt like he had been betrayed by Pironi. He was quoted after the race saying, quote, "I will never speak to Pironi again in my life." These words proved to be prophetic, as Villeneuve had still not spoken to Pironi when he was killed during qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix just 2 weeks later. The 2022 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. This was the second race of the 2022 championship, and the controversy isn't about the race itself, but rather the circumstances surrounding it. The host country, Saudi Arabia, is under constant condemnation for sports washing its human rights violations by using the Formula 1 Grand Prix. This was heightened by an event that occurred just 2 weeks prior to the Grand Prix, which was the 2022 Saudi Arabia mass execution, in which 81 people were executed by the government. And then on March 25, an Aramco oil depot, which was just 16 kilometers away from the track, or 10 miles, was attacked by missiles and drones. And this resulted in a very large fire. Black smoke could be seen during the first practice session. Despite the attack and all of the other controversy, Formula 1 and its organizers announced that the race would still go ahead as planned. But then, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which is just when all of the drivers get together, held a meeting that lasted for 4.5 hours, in which they discussed whether or not they should maybe boycott the race. According to the BBC, the drivers were eventually convinced to participate in the race after they were warned about, quote, "the consequences of not racing." reportedly, one of these consequences would be that the drivers might not be granted exit visas from the country if they did not participate in the race. I mean, that is genuinely concerning stuff. And so this whole situation just sort of got swept under the rug for obvious reasons. The 1985 South African Grand Prix. This was the 15th and penultimate round of the 1985 season. And if we wind back over 30 years ago, we find that Formula One was still holding races in controversial places. The race is infamous for being boycotted by a handful of teams and drivers due to the apartheid, which was the racial segregation that was happening in South Africa at the time. Some governments even tried to keep their drivers from entering the race. For example, Brazil's sanctions on South Africa nearly prevented Nelson Piquet and Ayrton Senna from racing. Even multiple sponsors just noped out and told teams that, hey, you can't put our logos on your cars during this race. Most notably, Marlboro and Beatrice Foods. It was later revealed that Lola team's Alan Jones faked an illness to just get out of the race. And this would be the final South African Grand Prix to be held until the apartheid was ended. The 2020 Australian Grand Prix. This was the race that never happened. This was intended to be the first race of the 2020 season, but just hours before the first practice sessions were due to begin, the event was cancelled in response to COVID-19. Now, I remember this quite well because this is by far and away the closest Grand Prix to me, but it's all the way down on tier 4, so I'm not sure how well known the situation is outside of Australia. The weeks before the Grand Prix saw several other major sporting events either postponed or cancelled as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was declared on March 12th, 2020. Despite this, the Victorian Health Department declared that the Grand Prix would still go ahead as planned. However, 5 crew members, 4 from Haas and 1 from McLaren, were entered into quarantine upon arriving in Melbourne as they were displaying flu-like symptoms. After testing for COVID-19, the Haas members came back negative, but the one McLaren member was positive. It was then announced that spectators would be banned from attending the Grand Prix if it were to go ahead, before the race was cancelled on Friday morning just a few hours before the cars were due to commence their first practice session. News subsequently emerged that only 3 teams were actually willing to participate in the Grand Prix had the event gone ahead. There was a lot of fallout from fans for a lot of reasons, but mainly due to the sheer lateness of the announcement, which was made as fans were quite literally standing in line for FP1 at the gates. After the cancellation of the Australian Grand Prix, the season wouldn't start up again until July, beginning with the Austrian Grand Prix. The 1978 Italian Grand Prix. This was the 14th race of the 1978 season and is scarred by the death of 2-time runner-up World Drivers' Champion Ronnie Peterson. The aftermath of his accident would change F1 safety forever. Peterson, being a Swedish driver, was nicknamed the Super Swede, and many believe that if he hadn't have died, he would have one day been a world champion. At the start of the race, the person in charge of turning on the green lights was over-enthusiastic, and so they turned the green lights on before all of the cars had actually lined up. And this caused a funneling effect of cars as they approached the turn 1 chicane. All the cars were very tightly bunched together, and so there was little to no room to maneuver. Going into turn 1, James Hunt was overtaken on the right-hand side by Riccardo Patrese, and so instinctively Hunt veered left, but this caused him to hit the rear right wheel of Ronnie Peterson's Lotus 78. The following accident was a chain reaction that would involve another 8 drivers as they were all just so tightly bunched together. Peterson's Lotus went into the barriers hard on the right-hand side. Peterson was trapped inside of his car, but amazingly, several drivers came to his aid, and Hunt, Regazzoni, and DePalia managed to free him from the car before he received more than minor burns. Peterson was dragged from his car and laid on the track, fully conscious, but with severe leg injuries. Sid Watkins, who at the time was the new head doctor of Formula One in only his 7th race in that position, knew that he had to get to the scene immediately. However, he didn't have a car that could get him there on time. And so this man had to get there on foot. And gosh darn it, I'll tell you what, he did. But by the time that he got there, the Italian police would not let him through because 1, he wasn't in a car, and 2, he was employed by FOCA and not the FIA at the time. So Watkins had to go back to the pits and wait to receive Peterson at the medical center, which would be another 20 minutes. At the hospital in Milan, Peterson's x-rays showed that he had 27 fractures in both legs. Peterson was then sent to intensive care so that surgeons could operate in an attempt to stabilize the bones. During the night, Peterson's condition worsened and he was diagnosed with fat embolism, which is when fat enters the bloodstream, usually as a result of fractures in either the femur or the pelvis. By the morning, he was in full kidney failure due to the embolism, and he would pass away at 9:55 a.m. on September 11, 1978. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the medical response. Why had it taken so long? And similar to Niki Lauda's crash at the Nürburgring, if the drivers hadn't taken it upon themselves to rescue Peterson, he never would have made it out of that car. This accident exposed just how ill-equipped the safety measurements were at the time. After this crash, Sid Watkins made demands regarding safety changes, including that a safety car follow all of the cars on the opening lap of the Grand Prix, a precaution that still exists in modern Formula One today. Watkins would also create a template that all tracks had to follow in terms of medical facilities. They had to be secure, in easy reach of a helicopter, and fully trained fire marshals had to be present. Knowing that the governing body would not do anything about it, James Hunt, Niki Lauda, Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti, and Jody Scheckter all got together and said that they would not race in the next round if Riccardo Patrese was there. And their influence was strong, given that they would ultimately share 8 World Drivers' Championships between themselves. And so for the next round, the Arrows team quietly withdrew Patrese from the race. Patrese would be acquitted in the courts 4 years later, as his car was actually ahead of Hunt and Peterson when the accident occurred. Mario Andretti would later say that the lobbying against Patrese was the most shameful moment in his entire racing career. So from this point onwards in the iceberg, all of the races are going to deal with people getting killed in one way or another. And in many cases, it is quite horrific. And while I'm not going to show any graphic imagery, I just want to give you the heads up that this is where we are currently at. The 1977 South African Grand Prix. This was the third round of the 1977 season, and if you do happen to look this one up by yourself, discretion is advised. This is definitely one of those NSFW entries. It's one of the more bizarre and disturbing deaths to ever happen in Formula One. On lap 22, Italian driver Renzo Zorzi, who was running all the way back in 19th place, had to pull off to the left side of the main straight due to an issue that he was having with his fuel pump, which caused his car to catch fire. Now, Zorzi did not immediately get out of his car because he couldn't disconnect the oxygen pipe from his helmet, but after a lot of struggling, he did manage to get out of the car. Now, this whole situation caused 2 track marshals who were over on the opposite side of the track to make their way across and intervene to help Zorzi. The first marshal to cross the track was a 25-year-old man named William, and the second marshal to cross the track was 19-year-old Frederick Jansen van Vuren, who was carrying on him a fire extinguisher. George Witt, who was the chief pit marshal for the race, recalled that both Frederick and William had crossed the track without prior permission. As the 2 marshals made their way across the track, the cars driven by Hans-Joachim Stuck and Tom Price made their way over the brow and onto the straight. Stuck just saw this, and he was able to move very quickly to the right and avoid both marshals by what has been described as millimeters. Stuck would later say, quote, "As we got to the top, I suddenly sensed this marshal running across the track from my right, carrying a fire extinguisher. I took a big chance and I don't know how I got away with it. There was no time. I reacted purely on instinct." From the position behind, Tom Price driving a Shadow Ford, he didn't see Jansen van Vuren walking across the track, and so he wasn't able to react as quickly as Stuck had done. Now, what I'm going to describe is quite disturbing, and there is video footage of it, so I'm going to keep my description quite brief. Jansen van Vuren was thrown into the air, and his body would land in front of Zorzi and the other marshal. He would die on impact, but his body was very badly mutilated by Price's car. There should never be an accident where entrails and intestines end up on the outside of the human body. Now, as if it couldn't get much worse, the fire extinguisher that Van Vuren had been carrying smashed into Tom Price's head. The impact of the fire extinguisher wrenched Price's helmet up very sharply, and he was almost fully decapitated. Death was almost certainly instantaneous. Price's car, with the driver now dead at the wheel, continued to go down the main straight at speed and towards the main corner. It then hit the car of Jacques Lafitte, and both Price and Lafitte's cars would go into the catch fencing and a concrete wall. Now, Vurin's injuries were so extensive that his body was not identified until the racing director got all the race marshals together the next day, and he was not among them. And all of this happened at a time when safety was just not a priority in Formula One. They didn't even have a safety car back then. And so despite this accident, the race would continue. And as bad as that is, it's only going to get worse, because now we're going to descend into the very final layer of this iceberg, layer 5. And as I mentioned before, all of the races in this final layer are going to involve people getting killed, and in horrific ways. So just keep that in mind as we continue on. The 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. This was the 10th race of the 1973 season and would mark the return of Zandvoort to the calendar following a year's absence, during which it underwent safety upgrades including new asphalt, new barriers, and a new race control tower. And the universe must have a twisted sense of humor, because ironically this race would be the scene for one of the most tragic and darkest deaths in the history of Formula One. That of young March driver Roger Williamson, who was competing in only his second race ever in Formula One. On lap 8 of the race, and through the high-speed S's near the right-hand corner, a suspected tyre failure caused Williamson's car to pitch into the barriers at high speed. He was catapulted 300 yards or 275 meters across the track and would come to rest upside down and against the barriers on the opposite side of the track. And whilst this was happening, the petrol tank would ignite and the car caught on fire. The thing was that, amazingly, Williamson had not been seriously injured in the impact, and so he was still fully conscious inside of the car. But he was unfortunately trapped inside of it because of the way that the car had come to rest upside down against the barriers. David Purley, who was another driver and Williamson's good friend, saw the accident, stopped his car, and dashed across the active racetrack in an attempt to help. Reportedly, Williamson could be heard yelling at Purley to get him out of the car, while Purley struggled unsuccessfully to flip the car back over. It seemed as if there was enough time to upright the car and rescue Williamson, but despite Purley's desperate efforts, he couldn't do it alone, and the marshals were not equipped with fire-resistant clothing, and so they were unable to assist Purley due to the extreme heat. Race control didn't have a good view of the accident from where they were, and they could only see smoke, so they assumed that it was Purley's car that had crashed and that the driver had escaped unharmed, completely oblivious to the fact that Williamson was trapped in his car upside down against the barriers. Many of the drivers who saw Purley waving them down to help later claimed that they assumed that Purley was just trying to put out a fire from his own car, having safely exited it, and thus they did not know that a second driver was involved. As a result of this, the race continued at full pace, while Purley desperately tried to save the life of his friend and fellow driver Williamson. With the car still burning upside down, the situation became hopeless, and a now distraught Purley was led away by a track marshal. And as can be seen in the race footage, even some of the spectators breached the safety fences in order to try to assist Williamson, but likewise they were unable to get close to the car due to the extreme heat. And with the race still on at full pace, it took 8 minutes for a fire truck to make its way around the circuit and to the scene. By the time that the car had been flipped back over and the fire extinguished, Williamson had died from asphyxiation. And as if this wasn't bad enough, a blanket was thrown over the burnt out wreck with Williamson still inside of it, and the race carried on. The 1961 Italian Grand Prix. This was race 7 out of 8 that season and is marked by one of the worst accidents ever in the history of the sport. During this era of Formula One, there was really no emphasis on safety. Like, I would say there was less emphasis, but there was literally no emphasis. For example, drivers in this era didn't even wear seatbelts, and the spectators would stand much closer to the track than you can today. And the barrier that was separating the spectators from the track wasn't a safety catch fencing like we have today either. It was just a regular fence, probably about this big. And for this race, we are at Monza, which is also known as the Temple of Speed. And so with that context, at the end of lap 2 and approaching the Parabolica corner, German driver Wolfgang von Trips would lose control of his Ferrari after he collided with the Lotus of Jim Clark. This caused Von Tripp's car to veer off the track and towards an embankment. His car then hurtled up the embankment, through the fence and into the spectators. Now, as Von Trips wasn't wearing a seatbelt, he was ejected from his Ferrari and died on impact. This accident would take the lives of 15 spectators, and I don't have a number for how many were injured, but I'm sure it was many. And this crash was absolutely horrific. And surprisingly and disturbingly, there are a lot of photos available of this incident happening. And the thing is, they're not low resolution either. One of the spectators who was killed in this accident was quite literally taking photos as the car was hurtling towards them. And I'm gonna pop them down in the corner, I think. There's nothing graphic in these images specifically, but you get a sense of just how terrifying it is. And to be consistent with the last few races that we have discussed, and because it was 1961 at the time, the race was not stopped. It just continued to go on. Now to us, this seems ludicrous, negligent, even kind of evil, but let me give you their reasons at the time. One, the race was continued in order to keep the audience from going home, which would have caused traffic jams around the track and in turn would have gotten in way of the rescue work for the injured. And then secondly, the attitudes at the time were just different. I think we tend to forget, but World War II was only 20 years prior to this accident happening. And so the people in Europe at the time were unfortunately very acclimatized to tragedy. And so this accident wouldn't have been as shocking to them as it is to you and me. One thing that's kind of disconcerting is if you watch the period newscasts of the time talking about this accident, there's these upbeat horns in the background and the commentator is talking about it like it's the weather report. But yeah, let's continue. The 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. This was the fourth round of the 1975 season, and even before the horrific accident, there was controversy going into the weekend. The race was held at the Montjuic circuit, and when the teams rocked up, they very quickly realized that the track was not up to scratch. The drivers, who were a part of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, were furious that the barriers weren't bolted together properly, especially since there had been 3 driver deaths related to faulty barriers in the previous years. So most of F1's biggest names got together and tried to boycott the weekend. But Jackie Ickx, who was racing for Team Lotus and was not a member of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, still wanted to race. So he drove out and participated in practice, and this must have given all of the drivers a big FOMO because despite everything we just talked about, they followed him out and joined him on the track. That night, the team mechanics did the jobs that the circuit owners should have done and they fixed the barriers. It took them the entire night, but they did manage to fix most of them. Fast forward to the race, and after several incidents in the first leg, on lap 24 would come the worst of them all. Rolf Stommelmann was coming through a fast left-hander when the rear wing of his Embassy Hill race car just snapped off. He lost control of his car and slammed into the barriers. But since the barriers had been repaired the night before, it did its job and stopped his car from plowing into the spectators. However, it ricocheted Stommelmann's car to the barriers on the opposite side, and his car went over those and into the spectators. Unlike the 1961 Italian Grand Prix, photos and videos of this happening are very hard to find, which I suppose is one of the reasons that it's been able to remain largely forgotten. But this crash was horrific, and it took the lives of 4 spectators, a fireman, a fan, and 2 photographers. Somehow, Stommelmann managed to survive the accident, and he walked away with a broken leg, 2 cracked ribs, and a broken wrist. Now, was the race stopped immediately? The answer to that is no, but 4 laps later, the race would be stopped. And this would be the first time in Formula 1 history that half points were awarded. And we've talked about half points a few times during this iceberg. This was also the first time and last time, as of me talking about this in 2023, that a woman scored points in Formula 1. And this was done by March engineering driver Leila Lombardi. And after this incident, the Montjuic circuit was abandoned and Formula 1 would never return there. the 1953 Argentine Grand Prix. This was the first race of the 1953 season, and this one is also very tragic and involves the death of spectators. And this accident has just sort of been lost to time due to how long ago it actually happened. Now, we've been through this, but safety in the 1950s was non-existent. It was actively dangerous. Now, remember in the 1961 Italian Grand Prix when the spectators were at risk when they were standing on that embankment and behind that fence? Well, take away the embankment, take away the fence, and move those spectators all the way up to the very edge of the track, and why not have some of the spectators just walk on the track as well? And you have the conditions for this Grand Prix. Now, this race marked the return of one Manuel Fangio, and he was sort of like the original GOAT of Formula One. Before the race, the president of Argentina proclaimed, "My children, let them in." And in a bid to promote Argentina's Grand Prix, he made the event free of charge to attend. This resulted in 300 to 400,000 people attending to watch the race. And just as a point of comparison, this single race had a higher attendance than most race weekends do today. The first concerns for crowd safety were realized when the Cooper of Schwalm Cruz had an axle failure, which caused one of his wheels to break loose and bounce into the crowd. Luckily, no one died from this. But then the tragedy that everybody feared might happen did happen, and it came on lap 32. Throughout the race, the spectators became wild. Ferrari's Mike Hawthorne said, quote, "Time after time, I waved for them to get out of the way, but this only made them worse. They began standing in the roadway, holding shirts and pullovers which they would snatch away at the last moment like a toreador playing a bull." End quote. So the crowd is literally on the track and they are bullfighting with Formula One cars. It was on lap 32 that Nino Farina, who was continuing to chase the Maserati cars of Gonzalez and Fangio, was caught out by the unpredictability of the spectators. A small boy ran onto the track and in front of Farina's car, forcing the Ferrari to take evasive action. He lost control of his car and plowed directly into the spectators. It's believed that Farina's crash killed 13 people. And after everything we have discussed in this iceberg, I don't think it will surprise you to find out that the race was not stopped. And with that is the entire the entire controversial F1 Grand Prix iceberg explained. Now, if you enjoy this iceberg format of video, I have more on the way. These videos take a ton of work to put together, and it's just myself doing it, so it is nice to know if people are enjoying it. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, hopefully.